I was so glad to see that this was how we worked. And you know, you think about it, we really bit off an impossible thing. We're supposed to like write and learn and perform new songs all in the period of like about a month or something. So it was like, strictly speaking, a little bit impossible.
Mike Williams, man, thanks for joining us, buddy, all the way from the States. How are you, mate? Good to have you on.
I'm doing well, Lee, and thank you for the invite.
Awesome, mate. Well, the reason why I got into you is I heard ages ago, like I reckon a couple of years ago, I listened to a podcast and I couldn't quite remember where it was from, right? So I'm pretty sure it was over at Greg Carlwood's Higher Side Chats, which is a great show. If you haven't gotten onto that one, you should try and get onto that one as a guest. That's a really good show, that one, actually. But I'm pretty sure he had this lady on talking about the Beatles and Paul McCartney. Was he killed ages ago and replaced? And, you know, the Beatles were this original boy band that was, you know, they weren't, the story that goes along with it isn't quite what it seems when you actually look into it and you start peeling back the layers. And for ages, I was like, that was so interesting. And, you know, and I kind of wanted to get back on it. I couldn't find anyone else really sort of doing anything on that one. And then I stumbled across some of the shows you had done, because I was sort of looking up Beatles Conspiracies on podcasts and stuff, and your name kept coming up as guests on people's shows. And I'm like, oh, man, I need to look into this guy. And yeah, you've done tons of work on it, mate. It is fantastic. Some of the work you've been doing, you put a lot of time into this. So today's show, folks, for the listeners out there, we are going to be talking about basically the Beatles Conspiracy. What is the deal with the Beatles? We're going to talk about Paul McCartney. There is a good a theory. Well, I guess I don't know if we can prove it or not, but we'll say it's a theory for now until we'll re-examine that when we get towards the end of the show. But Paul McCartney possibly replaced with someone else to continue the boy band to make sure the money kept rolling in. It's a lot of cool things about this one, and we're going to try and change a few people's minds out there. We might crush a few people the way they always thought about the Beatles. You know, people have a lot of love for the Beatles. I grew up on the Beatles because of my parents. They loved the Beatles. Always hearing them playing on a Sunday morning or something, you know, Dad would pull out the records and put them on, you know. So we kind of grew up around listening to the Beatles. And I don't have a problem with the music, to be honest. I quite enjoyed the Beatles. I mean, I'm sure you yourself, I understand you're a big Beatles fan from back in the day. So that, you know, the Beatles are a great band, but not everything's as cracked up as it appears, though, is it, Mike?
No. There's two stories with the Beatles. There's the story that is for public consumption, and then there's the story which I call the Beatles Conspiracy, which is very, very different than what most people believe.
And it has a lot of ties back to things, you know, Tavistock Institute, you know, like a lot of public perception management, you know, controlling how the public sees about political issues. And they use things like pop culture, bands, all this sort of stuff. We know that. We know that they do that now. They've been doing it for a long time. Just how long? Well, way back when the Beatles are doing it, possibly even longer as well. But it seems to be undeniable that the Beatles were used as this, as a tool, as almost a weapon against the people, in a sense, to control what they believe. You know, the public perception. It's so many levels, mate. It's unbelievable how many levels this is on about the Beatles and what they really actually were and who was controlling them, the names behind it all. It's phenomenal. So let's dive into it a bit now. Let's first of all, before we get right into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Mike. You've got your website. How did you start all this, mate? How did you get involved in all this sort of stuff and critical thinking and stuff?
Going back to 2010, I want to say, I think it's 2010, 2011, that's when I started really getting into alternative research. And I fired up my blog, and that's the Sage of Quay blog. And if you go to my hub website, sageofquay.com, you'll see a link there for the blog. So that blog has been going for a long time, over a decade. Then also in 2014, I started doing podcasting like you guys are doing, and I did that for a number of years. And then, I guess it was 2016, I read a book. The book is this book here. I have nothing to do with the book, by the way. I just happened to read it. It's the Memoirs of Billy Shears, and the author is Thomas U. Harriot. And I had known about the Paul is Dead conspiracy for a long time. When I was in high school, I knew all about it. I graduated in 1977. I'm going to be 65 years old in January of...
You look good for 65, brother.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I always say I think it's my wife's cooking.
You're nice. Yeah. You're a good wife.
So I got into the book, and I knew about the conspiracy because when I was back in high school, I actually put together a little lecture. Our high school back in the day was a bit progressive, and we were able to bring in guest speakers to talk about certain topics. I mean, it had to be approved and all that stuff. So I had submitted, hey, I wanted to bring my friend Adam's brother in, Doug, who was about 4 or 5 years older than us, to talk about the Beatle clues, the Paul is Dead clues on the Beatle albums and all the backmasking and all that stuff. And so I put this little thing together, and I didn't expect a lot of people to show up. And I was putting flyers in the hallway and all that stuff. And then when it was showtime, it was standing room only in the classroom that they had set aside for Doug to do his pitch. And so I knew about it, but back in the day, I thought it was essentially a marketing gimmick. We were always told that the Beatles were very clever and very witty, and so I thought, okay, so this is a clever, witty way to interact with the fans, sell more records and stuff like that. And then in 2016, I read the book that I just showed you, the Memoirs of Billy Shears, and as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, what's going on here? I mean, there was so much detail in the book, Lee and Andy, that logically you had to step back and think to yourself, okay, only somebody who is either the person playing the part or is very much in the inner circle would know this much detail.
Now, the Memoirs of Billy Shears, it's technically what they call, it's a fiction novel, though, right? That's what they classify it as, yeah? Historical fiction, right? So made-up fiction, basically, is what they're saying, you know. But this character seems, it's too plausible, isn't it? It's almost like they're telling us what really happened without telling us what really happened. Like it seems to be the way they want to do things. It's that law of karma. You know, they've got to tell us what they're doing to us in some way before they or while they do it or whatever. You know, so that the karma it's back on us, sort of thing. You know.
Yeah. So historical fiction is interesting because it's fiction, but it's within a historical context. So it is revelation of the method. So the person that's playing the part of Paul McCartney since 1966, the person that has the permanent contract. Paul McCartney died back, the book tells us, back in September 11th of 1966. Some researchers think it's August, some people think it's November, but the book says September 11th, 1966, and that's the date I go with because, and we'll get into this some more, but the Beatles are immersed in the occult. That's something that probably a lot of people don't know. And if you go to my website, if you go to my Paul is Dead channel, I go into a lot of detail about all of the occultism around the Beatles. So what I did, Lee and Andy, was I read the book. I was telling Sophia Smallstorm, I don't know if you know Sophia, but
yeah.
Sophia and I are good friends, and I was telling her I was reading this crazy book, and I was telling her a little bit about it, and she said, hey, Mike, you know, you should come on my podcast and talk about it, and I didn't want to do it. First of all, I didn't think anybody was going to be that interested in it. And the other thing is the book is 666 pages. There's the 666, okay? And so I thought to myself, how am I going to boil down 666 pages into a 2-hour presentation? How is that going to get done? I kept putting it off, hoping that Sophia wouldn't bring it up again, and then periodically she would say, hey, are you going to come on the show and talk about this Beatle thing? So finally I agreed. I sat down. I did boil down the 666 pages into a PowerPoint presentation, and I did that presentation and that discussion with Sophia back in September of 2016. And at the time, I thought it was going to be the only show I was going to do on it. Mark Devlin contacted me after that, and Mark asked if I would come on his show, and I said, okay, I would do a show with Mark. Mark's a friend of mine, and I think in that show, if I'm not mistaken, I think I said that this was the last show I was going to do on this. And I think that was in November.
It's too interesting. How can you not do more shows? It's too interesting.
Well, what happened was, Lee, is that I just didn't know how interesting it was going to get. Was it just about the replacement of Paul McCartney? As I dug more into the claims in the book, because what I was doing was I wasn't taking the book at face value. I was doing the research to either prove or disprove what the book was putting forth. And as I was progressing, I was finding that a vast majority of the book is truthful. The way to explain the book is it's like a big puzzle. The pieces of the puzzle are put out there, and it leaves it to the intrepid to pursue and follow certain clues and certain leads, follow the breadcrumbs to take you someplace. The book actually looks to have you go outside of it to validate information. And that's actually what I did when I did my big presentation on whether they wrote all their own music or not. I guess we'll get into that at some point as well.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting book. There are threads of fiction. There's no doubt about it. I've said this from day one. I said, but the book is in layers. So it has 4 layers to it. The first layer is you just read the book as it is, like you would read any book, and then, that's that.
Entertainment.
Yep.
Yeah.
Second layer is there are bolded out words on each page, and those bolded out words establish a second layer and a deeper dive into the story. Then there's a third layer that's called the acrostical code. The first letter of every odd number sentence, the very first letter, when you read vertically, forms more sentences. So that's the third layer, and now you're getting even deeper into what the story is all about. The fourth layer is a new set of information that the author, Tom Harriet, has put out. They're called the whisper messages. These are very faint messages in very faint font that tells puts forth, I should say, additional information.
Wow.
So it's a very complex book. There's people out there, some of them are researchers, and they want to call the book fiction, and they just want to chalk it up. But the problem is with doing that is what I have found is the vast majority of those folks that make that statement have never read the book. So I don't understand how you can pass judgment on something or editorialize on something that you're not familiar with. I just don't understand that whole premise. But what happens a lot of times is, there have been other researchers, or there are other researchers that are in the game, and they've been around longer than I have. I've been doing this for over 7 years now. And so they establish a certain premise that they hold on to. That's their premise. And what's happened is the book has broken some of these premises that some folks have held on to for dear life. And that's caused issues within the Paul is Dead community, because just when you think that you have it nailed down, the book comes out and says, well, maybe you don't. What a lot of researchers like to do in this topic with Paul is Dead is they want to start with Paul was replaced, and then they want to move forward from there. They don't want to talk about the creation of the Beatles. They still want to believe that the Beatles were this organic, naturally talented Paul McCartney and John Lennon, genius songwriters. They want to hold on to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a fantasy. They have this Cinderella story, don't they, that they just want to hold on to, otherwise it seems to it tears down all their sort of preconceived notions that, that these men were just this wonderful thing, but really it wasn't. People don't like to have that thought that they were lied to. What was it? Mark Twain famously said, it's easier to fool someone than it is to convince them that they've been fooled. You know what I mean? The people don't want to think that they've been fooled. And yet here they are. They've been fooling us for a long time and it's provable. Let's start getting into that a bit now about the Beatles and how they came to be. And then we'll get into how some of the impossibilities come into it as well. Because they were the original boy band, let's face it. Like nowadays, there's freaking TV shows about, creating boy bands, you know what I mean? Like, it's right in our faces. Whereas back then, it wasn't. It wasn't in your face. It was all hidden. It was controlled. It was, we need to produce these guys. We've got to control this, the narrative. It was all about the narrative, back then. Nowadays, it's like, it's just mindless entertainment for people to have a production, a boy band produced in their faces and pumping this shit right at them. Whereas back then, it wasn't that way. It's kind of switched a bit, but the way I see it is they were the original creation boy band, weren't they?
Yes, they were. And they were a creation of Tavistock. And Tavistock, for those folks that don't know, part of the deep state, there's an entire internationalist structure that's in place. And Tavistock is in the business of mind control and propaganda, working with the CIA, working with intelligence across the world, especially when we're talking about Western intelligence. Other groups that are tied in are Davos, we could say the World Economic Forum, the Bilderbergs, the Trilaterals, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome. This is the internationalist structure that is in place. And Tavistock, who, by the way, is basically bolted to the Rockefellers, has a huge, huge part in culture creation and social engineering. And I hope you don't mind me showing some books. So I recommend this book here. It's a great primer, Tavistock Institute by Daniel Estulin, Social Engineering, the Masses. Okay, it's a very good book to start with. Also, this book here, published, I think, first initially in 1993 by Dr. John Coleman. It's about the Committee of 300. Tavistock reports in under the Committee of 300. So if you start with those two books, Coleman actually, the book is not about the Beatles, but he has a number of pages in the book that talks to Tavistock's creation of the band. So the reason why the Beatles were created was because they wanted to change the culture. And what I have explained to my audience is that the music and entertainment industry is a gigantic lever in the toolbox of the controllers. All of the genres of music that have come about over the last 60 years or so, all of this has come through Tavistock. And so the Beatles were creation, and they were created in order to break down traditional values, to detach from institutionalized religion. In particular, they wanted a break from Christianity because Christianity was the predominant religion, especially here in the United States and across the world. So it was a process of taking traditional values, taking institutionalized religion, breaking down the morals, the ethics at the time, and bring about a new age. It's what Aleister Crowley refers to as the Eon of Horus, and the Beatles are very much tied into Aleister Crowley and his religion of Thelema.
A lot of this does go back to Aleister Crowley, doesn't it? And this religion of do what thou wilt, or whatever it was. We've seen that come up a lot, actually.
Yeah. So Crowley is an important player in all of this. Some people think he was nothing more than a carnival barker, but he was not. In fact, his religion of Thelema, which is Luciferianism, is the prevailing religious and spiritual philosophy of those that reside within the pyramid of power. In fact, that chart right there that you're showing, Lee, that is John Coleman's chart where that's his org chart. And he shows who goes where. And we can see Tavistock to the bottom left, up through the Committee of 300, and to the right, the Club of Rome, which is responsible for all of the environmental agendas and psychological operations and so on. Yeah. And attached to that, Stanford Research Institute and so on.
Yeah, so MK Ultra, all that stuff. Yeah.
All of that stuff. So Crowley's very important because Crowley, back in the early 1900s, he said that there was going to be a new eon, a new age, and we were going to move to what he referred to as the Eon of Horus, which we know as the Age of Aquarius. And he referred to the current age, or the Age of Pisces, or the Eon of Osiris, as a period of time, an age where humanity is shackled, they're not free, they are not following their pure or true will. And he had said that this was all going to change with the Eon of Horus, or the Age of Aquarius. The problem I have with what Crowley said is that when people hear this, they think, well, that's a good thing, Mike. I mean, why are you so hung up on that? It's because Crowley was part of the elite circle. And when he's talking about a new age and all of these good things that are going to come, he was talking to his elite friends. In fact, he wrote a paper called Book 77. And in Book 77, he goes through a litany of, I want to call them rules that somebody would do in order to pursue their will. And at the very end of Book 77, he says that anybody who gets in our way, anybody who gets in the way of you pursuing your will, you have a right to kill them.
Wow.
I'm serious. I mean, this is what it says. And then he goes on to say that everybody else, in other words, anybody who is not an initiate, anybody who is not in the club, will be our slaves. And this is what it says in Book 77.
And a lot of people, a lot of the elite subscribe to this thinking too. Like they're on board with this stuff, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. So, in other words, what's going on today, they are imposing their will upon us. So they're imposing their pure, true will. This would be the tenets of Aleister Crowley, of Thelema. So it's a battle of will. And that's what we're going through right now. The controllers are occultists. Make no mistake about this.
Big time.
They are occultists, big time occultists. And so when they go about change, their process is alchemical in nature. So there are alchemical stages that we're being put through in order for them to break down the old structures, in order for them to bring in their new age.
Yeah, out with the old, in with the new. That's sort of their motto, isn't it? They want to tear down these old structures of like you were saying before, Christianity and the way that humanity's been sort of running in the background for quite a while, with just the whole, story of Jesus and the Bible and God and all that sort of stuff. They want to get rid of that. They don't like that anymore. That's not the way they want to run things. So they have to get rid of it. They have to tear it down. And we see this. Look at what any army that does when they invade another country. They start tearing down monuments and statues and destroying churches and all this sort of stuff. They have to tear down their belief systems in order to impose the new ones.
Well, that's what the Roman Church did when they built their churches on the sites of pagan places of worship, their churches and sacred ground. So the whole thing here, why am I going through the whole Crowley bit, is because the Beatles are completely tied into the whole philosophy of Thelema and of Crowley. And the Beatles are, and I say are because they're still very much front and center in our culture. I refer to them as the Pied Pipers of the Aeon of Horus.
Is this evident through their music or through their imagery and album covers? Like, what leads you to this conclusion?
The stake in the ground that I have is 1960. So if we go back to 1960 and we take a look at what was going on in society, in our cultures, it was very traditional. We had Elvis and some of the acts going back into the 1950s. I refer to that as table setting for the Beatles. But when the Beatles came on board, that was to change the mindset of the young people. They didn't care about the older people. In fact, what they wanted, and Dr. Coleman addresses this in his book, they wanted the conflict between the adults, the mother, father,
and the youth,
with their children. They wanted that stress. They wanted that to fracture the relationship and have the kids break away. And that's what happened with the Beatles music. And we got familiar with them here in the United States in 1964, but they released their first UK album, Please Please Me, back in March of 1963. And then, of course, we have the release of Sgt. Pepper on June 1st of 1967, and this kicks off the psychedelic era, the Summer of Love. The way the Beatles were put together and the trajectory that Tavistock put them on, and EMI, their record label, because EMI and Tavistock were bolted at the hip.
Right, yeah.
The way they did this was to start very basic. And so, the Beatles first came out with their music on Please Please Me, and with the Beatles, it just seemed like, well, it's not that bad. It's rock and roll music, and, they're interesting with their mop tops and all of that stuff. But then what we started to see is a progression where the music would change. Revolver was the segue to the psychedelic era. It was the bridge between Rubber Soul going into Sgt. Pepper. So once we got to Sgt. Pepper, that's when the psychedelic era kicked off. And that's when we were talking about drug use, free sex, doest thou wilt. If it feels good, do it. That is doest thou wilt. That goes back to Crowley. It's the same thing with Nike's tagline, just do it. It's the same thing. So we see this all the time. So it's a break from the traditional societal and cultural structures that we had in place. And, the Beatles changed everything. They changed hairstyle. They changed the way people dressed. They changed even the way, people spoke. And when you think about it, how many young people decided that they were going to go pick up a guitar, play drums, and become a rock band because they wanted to be like the Beatles? So the whole rock music scene, like I said, all of the genres that are out there that currently and all of the ones in the past, all created by Tavistock. And the reason why Tavistock has different genres is because they know that each genre of music has a certain shelf life. And then there's a new generation or a new audience that they're going to manipulate and social engineer. So then they move to, the next genre. They could punk music, we have metal, we have glam, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, we moved more toward, like with Kiss, which had more satanic overtones.
Yeah, big time.
Right?
Yeah.
And just so people know, folks, I'm not a prude, okay? So I'm a musician, and I got into music because of the Beatles.
For those listening, Mike's got guitars hanging up in the background and all this sort of stuff. So he's a muso. He's got amps there. I can see mics. Yeah. So just for the folks that aren't watching the video version of this, yeah.
I was into it. So when I'm talking about how people were doing things differently, I was one of those people. So my mindset was changed. My mindset was very different than my parents, but you're thinking, well, it's just a new generation and that's how it goes. But the Beatles really were foundational to everything else that followed them. So some people might say, well, there's music today and I don't see the ties back to the Beatles. I don't see that. So I don't understand how it could be foundational. But what you do get is when they have these artists, when they have them on interviews and they're talking to them, many, many times there's a mention going back to the Beatles, going back to Paul McCartney. So they're making the tie that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a replication of the music or they're going to sound like the Beatles.
Like paying homage.
Right, they're paying homage, exactly, to the Beatles, because the Beatles are that foundation that everything else was built upon.
So let's talk about, so we've got the Beatles, they're now a creation of Tavistock. Let's just talk a little bit about how they started and then how they then got into creating, when I say creating in inverted commas, albums, apparently writing all this music, churning out multiple albums in a year, doing, I think was it Rubber Soul that was created within like 2 weeks or something apparently, like there's
30 days.
It was 30 days, there you go. So an album punched out within 30 days. Back then, now it's probably possible in a sense here with the way we can do things with technology and stuff. Back then, that wasn't possible. But we'll get into that. Let's just take us a little bit through now of how the Beatles came to be, where they came from, and how they got manipulated into being this new boy band and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, so I'll start with August of 1960. That's when the Beatles arrive in Hamburg, Germany.
Right. That's where they got their start, wasn't it? It wasn't in England. They actually kicked off in Germany, of all places.
Well, Germany is where they spent a lot of time looking to establish their performance skills, not their songwriting skills, because we're going to get into that, their performance skills.
Okay. And they couldn't do that in England? I found that, sorry, just to interrupt you there. I found that odd that they didn't want to cut their teeth in England, but they did this in another country. Was that on purpose, do you think, that they made them do this? They weren't exposed to ridicule, maybe, or?
They were doing shows back home, back in Liverpool. And at that time, it was Pete Best that was scheduling their shows. He was getting them the gigs.
The original drummer, correct?
The original drummer was Pete Best, right. So, his mother, Mona Best, had the Casbah Club, and that was in their house in the basement, and they were doing some gigs there when they were called the Quarrymen. An interesting note is that Pete Best's mother, Mona, had an affair with Neil Aspinall, who was half her age. And Neil Aspinall was tied to the Beatles, and he later on became the top executive for Apple Records. They wound up having a child, a boy. His name was Rogue. Okay?
Right, okay.
So it's kind of like it's all in the family type of thing. What happens is when they...
So they're in Germany, yep.
Yeah, so they go to Germany. Now they have a different manager. Now they have Alan Williams. Alan Williams picks them up. And, I consider Alan Williams really their first real serious handler. So he tries to book them into to Germany, and they're known as a bum group in Germany. And really nobody wants to touch them. But they get there in August of 1960, and it doesn't go well. And because at that time, John Lennon was 20, Paul was 18, George was 17. They're just young guys. And they were doing a lot of drinking, spending a lot of time with the ladies. The gigs that they got, they wound up sleeping in an old cinema, an old rundown cinema. The conditions were deplorable. So by the time they got to December of 1960, they had accomplished really nothing in Germany. In a book called The Lennon Prophecy by Joseph Niesgoda, it's a very good book. I recommend folks read it. He says that Paul and John, came back from that Germany stint in 1960 very dejected because, nothing really materialized. So then what happens is they are put on really a conveyor belt to continue to perform, not only locally within Liverpool, but also taking their stints back to Germany. And when they went to Germany, they were there for a number of weeks. And in an interview that Pete Best did a number of years ago, he said that the stints in Germany, they would play for 7 or 8 hours a night.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. So then, whatever time they left the club, they would go back to sleep or whatever. And he said that they got up around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And then they had to be back at the club by 6 o'clock.
Wow.
So they had a 3-hour window there. So this is when we get into the whole bit about people saying that the Beatles were writing all of this music. They were writing music back in Hamburg. They weren't writing music back in Hamburg.
When?
Exactly.
When would they do this? Yeah.
By the time you rolled out of bed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you've got to be back at the club at 6 o'clock, you're not writing music.
And probably hungover at times too. Yeah.
Exactly. The Beatles were playing copy music, cover music. That's what they were. They were a cover band playing bars and clubs. Their official narrative says, going back to The Complete Beatles, which was a documentary released back in the 1980s, it tells us that the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney specifically, between 1956 and 1962, they wrote 100 songs between them. But we never see the 100 songs. They never materialize. The documentary says they wrote them, but they were never recorded, which is very convenient, right? I wrote 100 songs, but they weren't recorded. So from 1961 to 1962, I mean, they're doing their gigs locally in Liverpool, within Germany. And then on January 1st of 1962, they wind up going to Decca to do a demo, Decca Records. And at this point now, they're connected into Brian Epstein.
Who's their new manager, is it?
The new manager, right. So, right, he's their new manager, right? So Brian Epstein was managing them at this point. So what happens is they go to Decca, they do 15 songs, and 12 of the 15 songs are cover tunes. And they do 3 songs which are nondescript originals that never made it onto any of their released UK albums. In fact, they did 3 songs. It was Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, Love of the Loved, and Love of the Loved finally was released on Anthology 1. So the point I'm trying to make here for the audience, folks, is that the official narrative tells us that between 1956 and 1962, John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between them. Yet when they go to Decca, they can muster up only 3 nondescript originals that most Beatle fans don't know. And every other song on that demo were cover songs. So then what happens is, they've got this Decca recording. Decca turns them down. Decca says, we're not interested. Brian Epstein takes tapes to George Martin, who is with EMI. George Martin was the head of the Parlophone label, which comes in under the EMI label. And when George Martin first hears the tapes, he tells Brian Epstein, I'm sorry, but from what I'm hearing, I'm not going to sign them either. And in interviews that George Martin has done, and I have these interviews and they're in my shows, he said that he didn't think they had anything behind them. They weren't showing any signs of being songwriters. He said that he thought their music was rubbish. These were his words. So George Martin turns him down. Then what the book tells us is George Martin receives a phone call from upstairs, from whom we don't know, and said, hey, look, you got to take them on. And so George Martin then is told to take the Beatles on board. They sign a contract in June of 1962. So think about this. Here's a band that started in August of 1960. They had nothing behind them. Their musical skills were marginal at best. They weren't writing music. And then from August of 1960 to June of 1962, 2 years later, they have a major record contract with a major record label, EMI, under the tutelage of a major producer, George Martin. So you have to ask yourself, how did that happen? Does that seem like an organic flow of things? No, that's not organic at all, right? So he was told to take them on. So what happens is George Martin, when he takes them on, he doesn't work with them initially. He assigns it to an assistant producer, Ron Richards, who later on went to go work with the Hollies. So Ron's working with them, and he's not having a lot of luck because they're not very good in the studio. In fact, there was an interview that going back to 1971 where their sound engineer, Norman Smith, who was their engineer from Please Please Me, which was their debut album, Through Rubber Soul, said that they failed in the studio and he wasn't impressed with them. So we have this thread between George Martin and other sources which are saying that, hey, look, musically they weren't there. Songwriting-wise, they weren't there. In fact, George Martin said that when he first got them on board, his first task was to go out and find songs for them to go record, to go put on an album.
Yep.
In August and September of 1962, when they replaced Pete Best with Ringo Starr, there was a local trade paper, the Mersey Beat, and it was about the music scene going back in the day. And in that article, along with announcing that Ringo Starr was replacing Pete Best, that article said that the Beatles are flying to London to record songs that were written for them and given to them by their record manager, meaning their producer, George Martin.
Little tidbits of information that proves that it doesn't really add up to the story, does it? The Cinderella story of these 4 working class heroes that have come along. Oh, they're great songwriters, written 100 songs, and we've performed all over the place. But everyone that's came into contact with them, from what I'm hearing from you, is saying subpar, can't write, can't play, sound terrible. And yet here they are. They're up on this platform because someone said to take them on. Someone higher up said, you got to get these guys on board. So there's definitely a plan for them, yeah.
Yeah, then you have to ask yourself, well, how did they wind up on the radar? So one of the things that I have suggested is that the Beatles, in particular, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but I'm sure that, George Harrison and Ringo Starr are probably in the same boat, were in some kind of program when they were younger, going back to maybe when they were in their early teens, maybe even before that, maybe preteen. And the reason why I say that, Lee and Andy, is because if you look for images on the internet, do a search on Paul McCartney, birdcage, George Harrison, birdcage. And what you're going to see is there's birdcage symbolism. Now, the birdcage is Illuminati symbolism for mind control. And in fact, I did a video. It's called The Occult and the Beatles in 3 minutes. It's a 3-minute video where I inserted all of these images that I had. There's tons and tons of occult imagery around the Beatles. We could see one-eyed symbolism.
Yeah.
The sigil of Satan, which is the double peace sign, which Ringo does all the time. That's how I believe they got on the radar. They were positioned and they were handled and brought along. So George Martin gets them. He doesn't see anything, really. I mean, he's saying he thought their music was rubbish. They didn't have anything behind them. The best song that they had, I use quotes around that, was Love Me Do. And then they released their first UK album, Please Please Me, in March of 1963, March 22nd, by the way, 322 is the Skull and Bones number. They've got 8 original songs on the first album, along with 6 cover tunes. So how did they go from having no music to being able to have 8 original tunes on their first album? There was no evidence that they were capable of doing this. In fact, the evidence that I have put forth many times in my presentations shows that they didn't have it. They weren't songwriters. Tavistock didn't need songwriters because Tavistock had songwriters. What Tavistock needed was performers. They needed a band that could front the music and put them out on the world stage.
Yep.
Send them out and go do the tours, go do the concerts. And so what happened was EMI, through George Martin, and I believe Theodore Adorno was tied into the whole psychological operation as well. George Martin I'm positive of. But, if you do enough work, you look at the Frankfurt School in Tavistock, you can tie Adorno into this. And in fact, in the book, The Committee of 300, Dr. John Coleman ties Adorno back to the Beatles. The Beatles were taught music. They were brought into the studio and they were taught how to play certain songs. And they would rehearse those songs. And these are the songs that they took out on the road. And people want to argue with me. They'll say, well, hey, look, we have recordings, we have audio of them on YouTube. We can listen to them. So if we have that, how could it be that they weren't in the studio working these songs? And what I try to explain to folks is audio without authenticated, genuine film footage to corroborate what's going on in the studio means nothing.
It's just audio.
It's just audio. And what escapes them is when you have a major psychological operation, there's going to be all kinds of manipulation that's going to take place. As an example, I pose this question to folks. How do you know what you're hearing on that audio is not them rehearsing the songs that they were taught and that rehearsal was recorded?
Yeah, you wouldn't know.
You don't know.
Possible.
Is it possible that that's what's going on? Honest people will then reluctantly admit that, yes, that is possible. Is it possible that what you're hearing is the Beatles singing to the pre-recorded tracks, the instrumentals that were recorded by studio musicians?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, people with honesty will say that's possible. This is why they did Let It Be. So the guy that's playing Paul McCartney today, I call him Billy Shears. I believe Billy knew that they didn't have that authenticated footage. Because when you think about it, we're told that John Lennon and Paul McCartney were geniuses, prolific genius songwriters, the greatest really in pop rock history. Yet, there is no film footage of them practicing their trade up until Let It Be. So I think what happened was Billy knew that there was a big gap in the story. I mean, we can tell you this stuff. We can write all kinds of articles and we could do documentaries and everything else, but there is no footage. And in fact, when Peter Jackson did his documentary, the Get Back documentary, that was the tagline. It's the only footage that exists of the Beatles actually writing and recording in the studio.
Was Let It Be.
Was Let It Be.
That was when Billy was on board, yeah.
Yeah, Billy came on board in 1966 formally.
So at this point, yeah, so Paul's dead, and we'll get into that in the second hour and stuff.
Yeah.
So Paul's dead at this point. He's been replaced with Billy. Billy's actually, now I want to ask you this, Billy's actually got some talent? Like, he is a songwriter?
Yes.
Yeah, so he's actually got some talent. So he took the reins. That's what you see. And when you see the Beatles, inverted commas, writing music or, recording in the studio at this time, they've had their time. They've cut their teeth. They've learned how to play a bit more. They're a little bit better now. They've honed their skills a bit more now. Billy's in control, and here we are. Look how awesome they are,
But even in Let It Be, Lee and Andy, when you look at Let It Be, what did they accomplish? When they went into Let It Be, this was the objective: to write and record 14 new songs within 2.5 weeks, do 2 concerts, and that would lead to a television special. When you watch the Let It Be footage, whether you're watching the original film or you're watching the Peter Jackson version of it, they couldn't do it. In fact, what we have is a lot of footage of them goofing around, resorting back to a lot of cover music, and then they get to the rooftop scene and we hear basically 5 songs. On a couple of them, they did a couple of takes, but basically 5 songs on a rooftop. That's not a concert. Who's going to see them on a rooftop? So what happened was, they couldn't do it. So even with Billy at the helm, Billy, who was formally trained and a very, very good multi-instrumentalist, they couldn't pull it off. Now, when I did my presentation back in April of 2020, did the Beatles write all their own music, to question whether they actually did write all their own music, and I concluded that they did not. Okay, that made its way into the book, and the book validated my conclusions. About 3 weeks ago, Billy was doing an interview. Billy, again, folks, he's the guy playing the role of Paul McCartney. Who you know as Paul McCartney, that's Billy Shears. I think it was on ABC television here in the United States. Part of that interview, he said that we bit off more than we can chew, that the objectives and the goals that we had for the Get Back sessions or the Let It Be sessions of 14 new songs was impossible. So here, Billy is telling us that they couldn't do it. So if they couldn't do it for Let It Be, the band had 7 years of studio experience under their belt. If they couldn't do it in 1969, what makes anybody think that they could do it in 1963, 64, 65, 66, and so on? But the elephant in the room, as far as the music goes, is Rubber Soul.
Yeah, so this is what I wanted to get into. So make sure we cover this in the first section of the episode for the listeners. Get onto that one now. So Rubber Soul album comes out, which I showed the cover art of before. What year was that again?
65.
65. So 1965. It's getting close to the later end of the year, getting close to Christmas time. Well, what do people do at Christmas time? Well, they go and buy gifts for people, don't they? They spend money. They go shopping. People want to go and buy gifts. So they didn't want to miss out on the good sales time of Christmas time of selling this Rubber Soul album around that time of year. Now, let's talk about how they accomplished this mammoth feat in the time frames within which it happened. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so what happens is they're doing their U.S. tour, and after the U.S. tour, they had a 6-week break or holiday. And they had to be in the studio on October 11th, and they had to write from scratch, essentially from scratch, 16 new songs and have it completely wrapped up in 30 days to wrap up by November 11th of 1965. So October 11th of 65, folks, 30 days to November 11th. 16 new songs. That's 14 for the album. And then they did a single, a double A-side single, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. Those are the 2 songs for the single. And the official narrative tells us that they came into those sessions with essentially no backlog of music. So they had to write from scratch. And let me just see if I can find something here, because some people want to argue that, oh no, well, they had some music. Well, they really didn't. The narrative tells us that they had partial or drafts of songs before the Rubber Soul sessions, which included some pieces of Michelle, some pieces of We Can Work It Out, and they had the song Wait, which had the basic rhythm tracks recorded from the Help sessions, which were earlier in the year in 1965. But here's the thing with Wait, because some people want to argue with me that, it wasn't 16 songs they had to write, it was 15. Like, that really makes a difference, 15, 16.
Changes everything.
But the thing is, Wait, the way the official narrative explains it is it was pulled out once they realized that they were struggling for material. So in other words, Wait was not one of the songs that they were coming in with. They didn't say, hey, we already have this one, so there's only 15 more to write. No, they came into the studio saying, we've got 16 to write. And then as the sessions became a bit challenging, that's when they pulled the song Wait out of the closet. I watched a documentary. Scott Fryman is the author. He does a great job. I mean, it's the official narrative. His presentation is very good. But, I've been songwriting for a long time, recording and so on. And I got 20 minutes into that documentary, that presentation, and I knew right away something was really off. Way off. Because as soon as I heard 16 songs in 30 days, I said, there's no way you can write 16 songs in 30 days. Now, when we talk about writing songs, it's not just writing them. Then you have to learn them. In other words, learning them means you have to teach the rest of the band the songs. You have to rehearse the songs. Once you rehearse, you're going to change things. You're going to change arrangements. You're going to add bits and pieces and so on. Then you've got to record the songs. How many takes is it going to take to record the songs, the basic tracks? And then you've got to mix the songs down. Let me just give you an example of the schedule that is the official narrative. It says the Beatles arrived in the studio on October 11th of 1965. One day in, they recorded the song Run for Your Life. They showed up on October 11th, October 12th. Run for Your Life is in the bag. On October 13th, 2 days in, Drive My Car is in the bag. Done. On October 16th, 5 days in, Day Tripper is done. On October 18th, If I Needed Someone, 7 days in, is completed. Now, the whole thing is like this. On November 11th, on the last day, they finished 4 songs. You Won't See Me, Girl, Wait, which was a leftover from the Help sessions, but they had to do the vocals and all that stuff, and then the song I'm Looking Through You. So you have to ask yourself, how is this even possible? This would be like saying the Beatles are a machine. They write a song on the spot, on demand. There's no throwaways. There's no reworks. There's no rewrites. They didn't start a song and say, oh, this is not going to work. Okay, let's move to
like
something else.
On the moon first try, isn't it?
Exactly. Everything they touch turned to gold. And you got to say to yourself, how can that be? So this is a chart. I'll just read from it, Lee. We don't have to show it. So in the month of October, 8 songs were recorded in 18 days with a total of 28 takes for all songs. So that means it was an average of 3.5 takes per song. Not one song that they did in Rubber Soul exceeded 5 takes. How can that be possible? You're writing the songs from scratch. You're learning them. You're rehearsing them. So what's going on here? In November, 8 songs were recorded in 13 days, 5 less days than in October. And they did that in 14 takes for an average of 1.8 takes per song. This is in the land of impossible. Okay, it's not even remotely feasible.
I mean, what people need to understand is that is the same as you're all in the booth, everything's ready, it's all set up. They start playing on cue, the vocals are correct, everything is correct at the same time, and it all marries up in one take. It doesn't happen. It can't happen that way. How does that happen? Every note is perfect, every strum, every beat, everything's perfect in one take. It is impossible. It cannot happen that way. Even the best musicians these days will still take multiple times to do a take.
Yeah, so they did 16 songs in 30 days with a total of 42 takes for all songs. That's 2.6 takes per song.
I mean, did they sleep? Did they eat? Did they, how did they leave the building? What's going on there?
Well, here's the thing. During the Rubber Soul sessions, that's when they received their MBEs. So they stepped out of the studio. They also took a day out to do a Christmas flexi disc. And then they took 2 more days out because they had a TV special to do. Rubber Soul, once you dig into it, it starts to come apart at the seams.
Yeah. Rubber Soul is the clue that gives it away that these guys weren't writing their songs, they weren't producing it, they weren't the be all and end all of best musicians and geniuses in the world. This is the proof, right? This is the thing that brings it all out and tears it all apart, right? This is the proof.
Right. That's right. And then I'll get into it in a moment. Because that's not the only problem with Rubber Soul. See, that's the first problem is the songwriting. It's the rehearsal. It's the recording. It's the mixing. But here's the other problem with Rubber Soul. They cut the lacquer, the final lacquer, mono lacquer, which is going to be used to press the actual records on November 17th. And the records had to be in retail in the stores on December 3rd. That's 2.5 weeks. How did that happen?
Yeah, maybe these days, maybe they could do it these days. You know what I mean? I mean, you struggle to get business cards created for you in 2 days, in a week. You know, sometimes how can they cut thousands and thousands and thousands of records in that short amount of time? Yeah, not only cut them, there's more to it than that. Go on.
The cycle time back in the day to get a record out was 8 to 10 weeks. Let's say 2 months from the time that you conclude recording. Then 2 months out is when you could expect to have the record out. Why is that? Well, because record sleeves have to be created. The center labels for the vinyl have to be created. So in other words, all the packaging has to be printed and put together so that when you press the records, you can put them in the sleeves, you can package them, stage them, and get them ready for distribution, and then get them out to the retail. Now, in order to have the record sleeves printed and the center labels printed, you have to know the names of the songs.
And the order of the songs, too.
And that's the sequencing. I'm going to get to that. Yes, right, exactly. So, of course, everybody knows this, right? The names of the songs are on the back of the album, and the names of the songs are on the center label that gets pressed onto the vinyl record, whether it be the 33 RPM record or the 45. The official narrative tells us that George Martin didn't finish the sequencing, the order of the songs, which songs in what order were going to be on side A, which songs in what order were going to be on side B until November 16th, the day before the lacquer was cut. Now, in order to do the sequencing, you have to know the run times. In other words, how long is the song? Is it 2.5 minutes? Is it 3 minutes? And so on. So you have to have the run times. Then once you have the run times, you could do the sequencing. Once you have the sequencing, then you could put the order in to have the record sleeves printed and the center labels printed as well. So if he didn't do the sequencing, he didn't finish it until November 16th. Well, how did the lacquer get cut on the 17th and the records begin to be pressed? I'm assuming that had to be on the 17th as well, or maybe even the latest, the 18th, because they really had to get the first batch of records out to the retail outlets by December 3rd. How did that happen? All of this artwork, all of the printing, all of the labels just fell from the ceiling into their laps and then they were ready to go? Because the way the center labels work, folks, the way they get adhered to the vinyl is during the pressing process. It's not done afterwards, which means the center labels with the names of the songs had to be in-house, ready to go when they were starting to press the records. Now, what does that mean? That told me that all of the stuff I just talked about, the printing of the record jackets, the sleeves, the labels, all of that stuff, had to have been underway way before the Beatles ever showed up into the studio, which means the names of the songs were already known, the run times were already known, the sequencing was already known, and the only thing left for George Martin to do was to have the Beatles come in to the studio between October 11th and November 11th to sing. They were there to put down the vocal tracks. They did not play on the record. That's what I concluded. Who played on the record, Mike? Studio players played on the record. George Martin, he had his studio session musicians.
And this wasn't that uncommon either, was it? Like, studio session musicians were a very common thing back then.
That's the thing, Lee and Andy. This is a very important point that you're bringing up. When I talk about this, people think, oh, it's blasphemy. No, it's not. I call it the Wrecking Crew model. Here in the United States, we had the Wrecking Crew. They were LA-based. We had Muscle Shoals here on the East Coast. And these were studio musicians, studio players.
Eric Clapton was a studio musician back in the day, wasn't he, as well? Some of the best-known musicians.
Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones. Studio players are the people that you're hearing on 98% of the records that came out in the 1960s and 1970s. It was the Wrecking Crew model. In the UK, they had their version of the Wrecking Crew with people like Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page. The songs were already written.
Yeah.
They were written by professional songwriters on the EMI/Tavistock staff. Some want to argue that it was solely Theodore Adorno. I don't subscribe to that. I believe Adorno, in all likelihood, did write some of the music as well as George Martin. I have a clip of George Martin saying that he wrote the guitar lead for Michelle. It was his composition. Those were his words. But I believe what they did was they had maybe 5 or 6 songwriters that were dedicated to the Beatles' psychological operation, to that initiative.
Yeah. It seems very plausible that that's the case, yeah, for sure.
So what they did was, they wrote the music, and then George Martin convened the studio players. He put the sheet music in front of them.
Yep. Record all this.
They banged out the songs, recorded all.
Beatles come in.
They sing to the pre-recorded tracks, to the instrumentals.
Yep. They just sing like karaoke to the instrumentals. Yep. Put it down, record that, and pump it out. And they could have, theoretically, they could have just sung all those songs in a day almost, and recorded them in a day, and then punched it out and got them all done.
Yeah, I think what happened was the songs came with a guide vocal, so they had to learn the melody.
Yep.
In fact, I've got a clip of them trying to do to get "Think for Yourself" down, which is credited to George Harrison, and that's on the Rubber Soul album, and it's unbelievable. They just had a very difficult time nailing the song, and I'm thinking to myself, why is George Harrison, especially George Harrison, having a hard time nailing the song down if he allegedly wrote it? I mean, typically, if you wrote the song, you have the melody, you know the vocal, you can sing the song, you're not the problem, okay? Maybe the others have to learn some their vocal parts and the harmonies and stuff like that. But it was, in my mind, proof positive that this was what was going on.
Yeah.
And then again, we go back to Billy saying that, hey, we bit off more than we can chew with Let It Be. You guys are supposed to be genius songwriters.
The greatest of all time, yeah.
Greatest of all time. And you're saying that, you couldn't do the 14 songs for the Get Back sessions or Let It Be sessions. So why should I believe that you can do it any other time before that?
Yeah. We've explained all this, that the Beatles are this manufactured group that didn't write their own things. Things were done for them. It was all pumped out there. And just reiterate one more time, like, why was that important? What was that all about? Just to wrap that finer point up there. Why did they do this? Why did they have to do this for this band? What made that so important?
The Beatles were really the first rock band, that was going to be foundational and set the stage for everything else that followed. The Beatles were important because the Beatles were really the first to manipulate the masses into culture change, to social engineer. And as I mentioned before, it was everything. It was the look. It was the obviously the music. It was the drugs. It was the whole psychedelic period. It was the free love. It was all of this. It was anti-establishment.
Why did the controllers, the Tavistock, why did the people, the social engineers, why did they need to do this? Like, we've established that they did do it. This is how they did it. They used the Beatles to do this, to control the narrative, all that sort of stuff. But why was it so important to them to do this?
It goes back to Crowley's Aeon of Horus. Okay, so they're occultists, and they're looking at the current age, the age of Pisces, which I believe we transitioned out of officially on December 21st of 2012. The whole Mayan calendar bit.
It was the end of that era. Yeah.
It was the end of that age, right. So they're moving to a new age. And their new age, they want a population of literalists. They want a population of people that march along to their thinking, to their agenda, to their philosophy. That's what they want. That's why religion had to get out of the way. That's why Christianity had to be blown up, because it was in the way.
Because back then, and people need to understand, like, this is my take on this, is that, back in, say, and in these eons, these ages last, roughly 2,000 odd years or something? Right. Back then, they didn't have mass media like we do now. So the way they controlled populaces back then was through religions and, pushing and enforcing their religions and things. And, later on they wrote down scriptures and things. And it was all about Yeah, that's how you control masses. You use the priest class to control larger groups of people, and those priest classes were basically in charge of populations and stuff. Fast forward, 2,000 odd years. How do you control the masses then? They started to do it through Bibles, and that was how they used the Bibles to control the message of the Piscean agenda back then. And but that age had to end. So how do you now do it again? You're at the end of the age now. How do you control massive amounts of population? Well, you do it through mass media, and mass media is taken on board by the masses through things like radio, television, newspapers, the written word, all that sort of stuff. But pop culture was really starting to take its grounds back then. So they needed to control pop culture, and this is one of the ways they did it. They did it via the Beatles, if I'm not mistaken, and that was how they pushed this new change, this new Age of Horus agenda onto the mass populations of the world, was push it through entertainment, get it on board that way. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that a bit of a summation there?
You're absolutely right, Lee, and you said something very, very important. Pop culture. So that's what culture is all about today. There's no true culture. People no longer really relate to their roots, their ancestry, none of that.
Very evident right
now.
It's
pop culture. It's hamburgers, it's Netflix, consumerism. Here in the United States, that's it. That's the pop culture. And the reason why they want this, folks, is because it's easier to control a mindset that operates that way.
Mm-hmm.
And make no mistake about it, when I say they're occultists, they are occultists, and where they're going, where they think they're going, is going to be a whole lot less people going with them. They don't want the masses trailing behind them. They don't want that. And so, they're looking at it as an eon or an age of enlightenment, but it's an age of enlightenment for them.
That's right. Agreed.
It's their version of illumination. It's not your version of it. And the Beatles played a big, big part in this. And a lot of times people still have a lot of difficulty getting their heads wrapped around this. But the Beatles, the music was so good. The music was good. The music was great. But it has an agenda behind it. That's what you have to understand.
Yeah, well done. Nail on the head right there at the end of that segment, mate. I really appreciate that. It's exactly what it is. There was an agenda behind the Beatles. Head straight over to sageofquay.com. That's the hub website for all the information there from Mike Williams here. Tons and tons of years of research and information, not just about the Beatles and Paul and all that sort of stuff. He delves into everything. It's really good. It's great stuff. But yeah, thank you again, Mike, and I'll be in touch, mate, and we'll try and punch out another show, if not before the end of the year, early next year, but we'll see how it goes up with time-wise and stuff, and availability, yeah.
Absolutely.
Fantastic, mate. Well, once again, great to have you on board, man, and great to meet you and to chat to you as well.
Thanks,
so
Mike.
good, mate. Much appreciated.
All right, guys. Bye-bye now.
How highly would you rate your own music?
We don't rate it. We don't sort of compare it and classify it like everybody else. Yeah.
Well, we're not very good musicians, and we never claim to be very good musicians. We're adequate, but not very good.
Well, what's the reason, do you think, for the tremendous popularity? Is it because people admire your talent, or...?
Well, I don't know, maybe they admire adequate music.